Eric Metaxas wrote me a letter. I just finished reading a book that was recommended by a friend called Letter to the American Church by Eric Metaxas. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about my impressions of it and some questions I have. If you're unfamiliar with the book, Metaxas uses his kind of framework that he's developed in his biography of Dietrich Bonhoeffer to talk about the German church in the 1930s and how the German church, in his estimation, could have stood up against the rising Nazi party and Hitler and said, no, we won't stand for this, and averted World War II and the Holocaust and all of those atrocities. I'm not an expert in that time period. I don't know if that's true. The church definitely bent over backwards and supported Hitler as a strongman against what they perceived as weakness in the rising progressive left. Should they have said some things? Absolutely. All of that is fine. I think Metaxas's book gets problematic when he starts applying the attitudes of the church in 1930s Germany to the attitudes of the church in 21st century America and making some, what I would say are false equivalencies. He offers many really important warnings about being faithful and speaking the truth and not wavering in your convictions in light of political pressures. And those things are all right and good, and we should be the conscience of the state, like he says, and we should offer critique to bad government policies. But his kind of kickoff example in the German church in the 30s was Hitler's prohibition of ethnic Jews from serving in the German church. This incredibly wicked racist law called the Restoration Act, I think, comes out prohibiting Jewish Christians from serving in the church. They have to be expelled, they have to be removed, and by and large, in Metaxas's telling of the story, the church does nothing. Now, he doesn't quite come out and say it, but he, throughout the book, kind of weaves this into things like the COVID-19 pandemic, mask mandates, and shutting down and isolating for a season. And that seems to me to be a false equivalency. There were a lot of factors surrounding what happened during COVID. Some church leaders in some places had much harder decisions to make than others, but the kind of government intrusion into the life of the church and its moral implications during COVID-19 seem to me to be vastly different than the Nazis proclaiming that ethnic Jewish Christians are not allowed to participate in serving the church. That seems to be a very different bar, and I would hope, and I would argue that many people in the Christian church today in America would push back hard against that sort of intrusion, especially with the sinful implications of it. But then as Metaxas weaves his narrative and chastises the American church for not being political enough, for focusing on preaching the gospel at the expense of hurting people's feelings by telling them things they don't want to hear. I mean, there's all of these points of agreement that I would have with his analysis here and there: the right to life for the unborn, the need to be clear about biblical sexuality and gender. I mean, these are things that I would say the church is really good about standing up against, and maybe not everybody's church, maybe not every church in the nation, but when I look out on the landscape of the United States, I see the evangelical church often raising the alarm against some of these things that the government is doing, that culture is doing, that Hollywood's doing. I mean, the sources of this wickedness come from different places. But as Metaxas talks about these things, he continues to weave them together with the story of Bonhoeffer that in his mind comes to a climax when Bonhoeffer decides to join the movement to assassinate Hitler. He seems to be encouraging Christians in the United States that the time is coming, or maybe has already come, where we need to rise up, not just as a prophetic voice of protest against immorality, which I think is true, but to rise up maybe violently to oppose the radical leftists in our midst. And I just think that's misguided. I just think that's dangerous. We are not in a position in this country for armed violence against the state. It's just insane. We live in one of the most prosperous, free nations in the world. And yes, there are multitudes of problems with our political establishment, with kind of the moral fabric of our country. But to compare us to 1930s Germany and the rise of the Nazis is just such a false dichotomy. Now, may there come a time when the church needs to stand up against unjust laws and say, no, we're not going to participate in that? Absolutely. But if the biblical witness is something that deserves to be respected, which I think it does, our role is not to stand up and violently overthrow the government. Our role is not to stand up and assassinate whoever the wicked leader we think is in office. Our role is to be willing to suffer and die for the sake of the gospel, to love our enemies to the point of death, to conquer the enemy by the blood of the Lamb and the word of our testimony, and to not love our lives to the point of death. And for Metaxas to equate the work that the confessing church did in Germany to stand against the Nazis with somehow voting for Donald Trump or being anti-mask mandate or having some kind of aggressive posture against wokeness is not only a false equivalency, but I fear that it inspires people to see the world that we're living in with all its problems as much worse than it really is, and to take radical steps that may not be warranted today or ever by the people of God in order to fight back against what we perceive as an enemy. The church has always been a prophetic witness to the nations when it is operating correctly in its role in society, and its prophetic witness always comes with a posture of humility and grace and a willingness to work sacrificially for the love of our enemies. This is who Jesus is. This is the path that he walked. This is the kind of character he's cultivating in his people. And I think we would do well to step away from the precipice of everything is going to hell and we need to stand up and fix it, and instead say, God is in our midst, so we can speak truth where there are lies. We can stand up for the oppressed where we need to. And we can joyfully suffer the consequences of our own marginalization if and when that comes. So all in all, I think Metaxas' book comes from a place of concern for the people of God and hope that we would stand up against injustice in the coming days. But what I see is Christian men and women committed to the historic truths of the gospel, stepping up to say, hey, we're not going to do this. We're not going to participate in this. And we offer a better way forward on issues where our culture is lost. But then on other issues, we are the ones that need to step back and recognize that we can't use the world's powers to achieve Christ's ends.